Simplifying powers of I. The powers of I are cyclic. Let's look at what happens when we raise I to increasing powers. If we have I to the 1 power, it just equals I. We know the definition of I squared is equal to -1. Now what happens when we have I cubed? Let's go back to what happens when you multiply something with the same base. We can rewrite this as I squared times I. And if you notice, that I squared is the same thing as -1. So -1 times I is going to give you -I. Next we have I to the 4th, which can be broken down as I cubed times I. So if we go back to what I cubed is -I, so we can replace I cubed here with -I times positive I gives you -I squared, and that is a negative times I squared, which is -1, which gives you +1. If we look at I to the 5th, we can break this down as I to the 4th times I. Now I to the 4th equals 1, so we can replace I to the 4th to be 1, and so 1 times I is I. Now if you notice that I to the 1st power was I, so it's starting to repeat because we can see that when we get the 5th power of I, it is equal to what the 1st power was. So as we continue to multiply I by increasing powers, we will see a cycle of 4. So let's examine the next 4 powers of I. So we have I to the 6th, which is equal to I to the 5th times I. So remember that I to the 5th is I, so we can replace that with I, and I times I is I squared, which gives us -1, which is the same thing that we got for I squared, which is -1. Okay, next, we have I to the 7th is equal to I to the 6th times I. Remember that I to the 6th is equal to -1, so that's -1. So we can say that -1 times I is going to give you -I. Or we can break it down as I squared times I, which is equal to I cubed, which is equal to -1, because these all equal the same thing. So therefore, just taking a -1, multiplying it by I gives you -I, and again it matches what we have over here. Next, we have I to the 8th, which is equal to I to the 7th times I. So I to the 7th is the same thing as -I, so we get -I times I is -I squared, which is the same thing as negative times -1, which is 1, which is what we got in I to the 4th. So again, it's starting to repeat itself for every 4. Then we have I to the 9th. So I to the 9th is equal to I to the 8th times I. Remember that I to the 8th is 1, so 1 times I gives you I. So again, it's going back to starting over at I again. So again, the cycle repeated continuously, so you're going to have every 4 powers as I, -I, -1, -I, and then 1. Okay, next. Example 8, simplifying powers of I. So we want to evaluate I to the 35th power using some of the rules that we have from up here. Okay, but my recommendation is you want to always try to find a base of I squared. So always eventually determine a base. So look for a base of I squared. So when you take a look at I to the 35th power, we can break this down to be I to the 34th times I, because when we multiply the same base, 34 plus 1 gives you 35. Now the reason why you want to factor out the I here is so that we get an even number. And what that even number allows us to do is now write this as a base with an exponent raised to an exponent. So here is that I squared that I was talking about here. I squared, meaning 2 times what is going to give you 34? Well, that's 2 to the 17th. So I squared to the 17th power gives you I to the 34th times I. And now I squared is the same thing as negative 1. Well, this negative 1 raised to an odd power is going to give you a negative. Let's just verify that on our calculator. Okay, if we have a negative 1 raised to an odd number, it's always going to give us negative 1. So regardless, if I have negative 1 raised to the 99th power, it's going to give you negative 1. And what do you think is going to happen when it's positive? So when we have a negative 1 raised to an even, so let's say that's 20, we're going to get a positive 1. If I take negative 1 and raise it to, let's say, 888, since that's an even number, that's also going to give us 1. So we can use the idea of I squared, which is going to allow us to be able to simplify it a lot quicker and have it to break it down how they did at the beginning here. So therefore, we end up getting negative I. Now, if we want to evaluate 18, okay, we don't need to break it down any further because 18 is already an even number so that we can factor out a base of I squared. Well, what do I have to multiply by 2 to get 18? Well, that means I squared raised to the 9th power. So again, negative 1 to the 9th power, it's an odd exponent, which gives us negative 1. Let me give you another number here. Let's say if I had I to the 45th. Okay, so we're going to break this down to be I to the 44th times I, because when I multiply them together, it gives me I to the 45th power. And then I'm going to write as I squared. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, and you can say, what do we need to multiply by 2 to get 44? Well, the answer is 22 times I. And remember that I squared is negative 1 raised to 22 times I. Well, since 22 is an exponent that's even, negative 1 raised to an even power is going to be 1 times I, which just gives you the value of I. So again, if you break it down to look for the I squared, it's just going to be a lot easier as you solve these types of problems.